All right, what's up, guys? It's Emmanuel here, and today I'm going to be talking about what a TSP is. All right, so to get started, TSP stands for Thrift Savings Plan, right? And that is the equivalent to a 401k, which you will see on the civilian side or outside of government work, which I guess that kind of tells you what a TSP is. So a TSP is the 401k that is provided by the government. And so with that being said, anybody who works any federal jobs, any uniformed personnel, active duty or reserves will have access to a TSP. So there are two different types of TSPs that you can have. You can have either a Roth or a traditional, which is a direct reflection of when you open your own 401k or when you have an IRA. We have those two options. And so whenever you think Roth, you should think that the money is being taxed now so that you can get that tax-free later. And then when you think traditional, it's money goes in not taxed today and it'll be taxed later. When it comes down to picking which one you should do, whether you should do a Roth or a traditional, I saw some statistics and I went and did some of the math. A lot of times it ends up breaking out to being the same amount. But in the case where you think that you will be in a significantly higher tax bracket later in life, then you should probably go the Roth route. And that way you can get that tax now, and then you can make those tax savings later if you think you're going to move up in tax bracket. If you think that, hey, maybe I'm going to live on less or I'm going to change my tax bracket and get lower later in life, then the traditional may work better for you. Say if you make a lot of money today, like, upwards of $250,000, but you're expecting in retirement, you're going to live on 100K, or half of what you make now, then traditional works versus vice versa. If you don't make as much today and you're expecting that when you're in retirement, you're going to live really abundantly, then a Roth may work better for you. But when it comes down to the numbers, a lot of times, most of us don't really change our tax bracket significantly. And so that way the Roth and the traditional, typically kind of the numbers kind of come out in a similar fashion on what you end up paying in taxes at the end of the day. And just a thing I want to cover before we actually get really deep into the TSP. A lot of the things that I'm talking about will be equivalent in a 401k. And so if you have a 401k, you can still listen to this video because a TSP and a 401k are almost direct replicas of themselves. Just one is given by whatever personal company you work for, whatever private sector you work in, versus the TSP is provided to those government workers. This also works for if you have an IRA, which is an individual retirement account, which you can open through any bank. I want to say almost every bank out there gives some opportunity of an IRA. And IRAs also have the Roth option as well as the traditional option. So what's inside of a TSP and what can you invest in when you're in your TSP? So the TSP gives 6 funds, really 5, because the G fund is not considered an investment fund, but it's inside of something. It's money that you can put inside of the in your TSP. So starting from the least risky, then going to the riskiest, you do have, like I aforementioned, the G fund. What does the G fund stand for? It stands for government securities, right? And so what that is essentially think of your treasuries, right? So it's kind of an older concept, but back in the day, you can go to the government and you could say, I want to buy one of those IOUs, right? So you give the government $1 today, and in 10 years, they give you $1.20 back or whatever it may be. Typically, those things try to match inflation or right on par inflation, or maybe inflation by a basis point or two, but it's usually kind of in line in inflation because the government securities are literally the US dollar, essentially, right? There's no companies behind it. You're not really investing in like any type of products or anything. You're literally investing in the US government. So it's safe. You're going to get your money back unless you think the US government's going to fall. Anything short of the US government falling, you are all but guaranteed to get your principal back on those with a little bit on top. The G fund also pays a little bit of a dividend. It gives you a slight interest. I tried to find that number. I couldn't get it. There's kind of just when I looked up the definition and I wanted to make sure I explained this correctly, it's kind of a broad general definition. And so I had to do a little bit of inference and a little extra research on my own to find some of that. And I could not find the exact interest payment that you would get from the G fund, but it does do a small little interest payment on it. And I'm gonna go ahead and assume that that interest rate probably has something to do with the same as the Fed's interest rate, because the Fed's interest rate is basically like it correlates to what banks charges and what your mortgage rates are. And so when they raise their interest rates, they're able to pay more interest. So I'm pretty sure that G fund interest rate will definitely correlate with that interest rate that the Fed has currently. So the next fund we have is the F fund, which is the fixed income investment fund, right? And so this is the first index fund that I'm going to mention, right? Because the G fund is technically not an index fund. And so the fixed income investment index fund is kind of a mouthful, goes off of those bonds. There are some government-backed securities in this as well, but they're a little bit different. As well as you have corporate bonds, you have international bonds, foreign bonds, and things like that. And so this one is an index fund based on that. If you've ever heard of like a mortgage-backed security or any of those things, if you've ever seen the movie The Big Short and stuff like that, that's kind of what caused the housing market crash, was because everybody was kept packaging all those mortgage-backed securities and they were bad written mortgages, which makes this fund sound a lot more riskier than it is. It really isn't. Typically, these bond funds are usually pretty safe because bonds are similar to a stock, but closer to a treasury. So they're kind of in that middle ground. And so with this, the F fund does pay a dividend because those bonds do give interest rates. And so you would get a little bit of an interest based on this fund. Like I said, I also couldn't, the same way with the G fund, I couldn't find exactly what that interest rate is, but I know that this interest rate is paid monthly. And I'm going to go ahead and make that same assumption that the interest rate that this pays definitely correlates with the interest rate that the Fed probably currently has. Wouldn't be the same. Don't take the mistake of me thinking that it's the same. Like if the interest rate that the Fed gives right now is 7%, during the time of this video, I want to say 6.5%. But just because it's 6% or 7% by the Fed does not mean you're going to get a 7% interest rate in this fund. It just means that because the Fed's interest rate is higher, you may get a higher interest rate with these funds. And so with this being an index fund, there is an equivalent outside of here, and Vanguard BND would be a good reference point to if you want to know what this fund may include. It's kind of hard to find that information through TSP because they only tell you that it's an index fund and they're kind of closed in as far as what's in it and what's out of it. But they do let you know like what they are investing in, like the type of securities or the type of stocks that they're investing in. And so BND would be, Vanguard's BND would be a very close equivalent to what this fund has inside of it and can be used as a reference point on whether you think that this fund would be good for you. And so the next fund, and of course, slightly riskier up the ladder, would be the C fund, which is the Common Stock Investment Index Fund, which honestly, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is almost the exact equivalent to the S&P 500. Maybe a company or two, maybe swap, but I don't think they did anything. They didn't try to reinvent the wheel here. They literally took the S&P 500 and said, boom, we got it, made the C fund. So any S&P 500 you can think of, which there is only one S&P 500, but I'm talking about the ETFs or any index funds that you could find, will be this exact fund. So I personally use Vanguard as another brokerage account that I have, and so I have VOO, which is in there, which is the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, and this C fund is the exact equivalent to that carbon copy. So if you just go look up the S&P 500, you will see this. The great thing, although this does count as a riskier one, the great thing about this is because it follows the S&P 500, you're going to get similar returns to what the S&P 500 is, which since 1957, I think I got that right, March 4th, 1957 is when the S&P 500 was officially the S&P 500, because it became a thing in the early 1900s, but then they experimented with 20 companies and then 90 companies. Long story short, eventually they got to 500 to say, this is what the U.S. economy is doing. This is what big businesses affect the GDP. And they came up with the S&P 500. And so the point I was trying to make here, since 1957, the S&P 500 has grown on an average of 10%. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get 10% every year. Some years it's 20, some years it's negative 20. But the average over that time span is 10%. So if you put your money here, you park your money here, and you leave it in there long enough, you will 100% get to S&P 500. And when we're talking about a retirement account, especially if you're in your 20s and your 30s, I would highly recommend just doing the C fund because you can just plug and play, don't have to think about it. And as long as the US is still there, the S&P 500 will still be there, and your account will grow 10% year over year on average, of course, always on average, and you will see marvelous returns from that. So the next fund is slightly riskier than the C fund is the S fund, and that is the small capitalization index investment fund. So with that being said, you have the S&P 500, which is the top 500 companies, which is the C fund, and then the S fund is an additional 4,500 companies, which can be found in the Wilshire 5,000, which I'm gonna put the name right here, Wilshire 5,000, and those are the companies that make up the S fund. Essentially, it still follows the US economy, and I don't want to misspeak and say that what the stock market does is a direct reflection of the US economy, because although they correlate, they do not causate. It's kind of like, the best way to explain it is, people who gamble on sports, right? If he's in the stands and he's gambling up on the 100th deck of a baseball game, I don't know, he's in row 200, his bets may be based on the baseball game, but they don't affect the baseball game. So that's kind of how the stock market and the US economy go. People make decisions on whether they want to buy this company based on what the economy may be doing. Sometimes that reflection could cause maybe a ripple effect in the economy, but they don't all the way kind of directly run side by side. They can go different ways. The US economy could be booming and the stock market could be down, and I just wanted to get on my soapbox for a moment and say that. But to get back to the point, the S fund does include those 4,500 companies that are just outside of the S&P 500, and they fall inside the Wilshire 5,000. And so they are considered a little bit more riskier companies because they're less established and not as large. They don't have as many employees. A lot of those companies probably don't pay a dividend because they haven't been around long enough. So a little fun fact here is that this S fund has outperformed the C fund since the incorporation of the S fund into the TSP. And so you would think that the bigger companies should do better, but the smaller companies, they have the opportunity to grow. They have more vertical growth that they can do. And so it kind of makes sense to see why the S fund has outperformed the C fund. Now, it has been a little bit more volatile. It does swing a little bit more. And so I would suggest making this a smaller part of your portfolio, but I would definitely have that in there. Especially like I said earlier, we're thinking about retirement here. So retirement age is what, 61, 62. That's about the time when you're thinking about when and how you're going to retire, and about the time that you can start taking your contributions without being penalized. And so with that, 62 and a half is the age when you can start getting that money from your TSPs or your 401ks or your IRAs without being penalized by the government for that. And so if you're thinking about that long time horizon, like I'm 27 years old, what is that, 37 years before I'm thinking about taking from my TSP, it's worth having something like the S fund in there. And so the next fund, which is slightly riskier, but I don't like explaining it that way because this one's a little bit different, and it's the only one of its kind inside of the TSP, is the I fund. And that stands for the International Stock Investment Index Fund. And so what that is exactly how it sounds, is you're investing in international companies, right? And so typically that includes Europe, Australia, and the Far East. So this international fund kind of mirrors the Morgan Stanley EAF, which is the Europe, Australia, and Far East. And so if you want to ever look up the Morgan Stanley EAF, that'll kind of give you what should be inside of this fund. Like I said, I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of research. It's kind of hard to find exactly what are inside of these indexes, but these indexes are based on real indexes that are in real, I don't want to say real life, like if the TSP is fake, but out there, outside of the TSP, there are indexes that these TSP index funds try to mimic and try to mirror. So I think your best bet, as far as if you want to try to see what may be inside of this I fund, would be the Morgan Stanley EAF. And so if you look that up, it should give you a real good indicator. And so the last fund I want to talk about is the L fund, which is it's like kind of a target date fund. So if you have a date that you know you're going to retire, or a date that you expect to be pulling these contributions out, they have funds that are targeted for that date, and it'll do the allocation for you. So as you get closer to your retirement date, it'll take your fund from being risky and then try to move it towards being less risky, so that when it comes to that retirement time, it's easier to take that money out, and you don't have to worry about us being in the down market. You don't have to worry about interest rates. You don't have to worry about any of those things, because the fund is going to take all of your aggression early, And the closer you move towards that date, the less aggressive it's going to be and the more safe it's going to become. And so I would say the L fund would be great for people who absolutely don't even want to do a single lick of research. You don't want to know what a stock is, don't care what a stock is. You just want to put your money away and make sure that it's there when you become of age to utilize it at 62.5. And so the L fund would be great for you. Target date fund, if you look up any target date funds, it's kind of mimics that exactly to a T. The TSP does a really good job of, it doesn't try to reinvent the wheel. If there's a fund out there that exists that covers that sector, they kind of get as close as possible to that fund to make sure that you get all of the benefits of those funds, but you get all the protections of this TSP being inside of a government-backed situation. Now, with that being said, let's talk about the expense ratios that are in these funds, because every single investment avenue has some type of expenses. And so before I get into them, I felt like the numbers were a little higher than I may have been comfortable with initially before I started my TSP. So it's not my only form of retirement, but I still have it as a retirement. And if you don't plan on doing any additional research and you don't plan on going to look anywhere else, then expense ratios honestly are not that crazy. But just because I am really big into investing and I'm really want to retire abundantly, I went and did some research on that, and I went and found out what expense ratios are supposed to be and what they look like. So with that being said, I'll tell you what the ratios are. So the G fund is a 0.057, which for what it does, I definitely feel like that is a little high, because yeah, you get paid an interest rate, but your returns are typically gonna match what inflation is, right? And so you're not going to really beat inflation with that. And so kind of with that 0.057, you're almost losing there. So that's why I highly suggest not leaving your money into the G fund. You might as well keep cash if you're gonna keep a lot of money inside of the G fund. And then the F fund, that fixed income investment index fund, is a 0.078, which for the type of fund that it is actually decent, because you get an interest rate there and you're getting monthly interest payments. And so that 0.078 annual fee is not that high, right? Could it be better? Yes. So it's up to you to do that research and to market to see if you want to try to take another investment avenue. But if you're a government worker, TSP is typically your only government or like your only internal retirement option, which I haven't even spoke about yet. And it also provides matches. So the fact that they match you would probably pay for that 0.078 interest rate anyway. I misspoke. Expense ratio anyway. And so I don't think that is too absurd for what that fund does. The next one is the C fund, which is a 0.059, which I know I just talked about a 0.078 as not being that high, but then 0.059 for the C fund I think is slightly expensive. For example, I have VOO, and my one of my accounts that I have outside, it's not a retirement account, it's just one of my regular brokerage accounts, and they only have a 0.03 expense ratio on their equivalent VOO to this C fund. So that's almost double, when you put it in perspective. So it can feel a little bit high, but like I've already spoke, if you're working for the government, TSP is kind of your only internal retirement option. It's not like you can shop around. But for those who have a 401k or something like that, if you have an option for different 401k plans and stuff like that, I would definitely pay attention to those expense ratios, because those could really cut into your growth, right? And so most of your income, especially when you're looking at 20, 30, 40-year horizons, will come from that interest, those dividends, and all of your returns, right? Your principal will only be so much of it. And matter of fact, it will be the smallest part of it. The longer time horizon you have, the smaller your principal, the money that you've put in would actually be. And a lot of that will be on the returns. Typically after $100,000, you will start to see those returns over and exceed those principal payments. So when you're looking at a 0.059 expense ratio, that means that 10% return that I spoke about earlier now becomes 9.90, whatever it may be, whatever the 10% minus 0.059 is. Not the worst, but you know what I'm saying? I just compared it to VOO, which has a 0.03 expense ratio. And so the S fund has a 0.09 expense ratio, which also I do think is a little bit high. I understand a little bit why that one's a 0.09 though, because it is those small cap companies, they get taken out and removed a little bit more often. Plus, there's 4,500 of them to keep up with. And so, although they are just following an index fund, it does take somebody who goes in and makes the decisions for, does this stay, does this leave, and somebody got to get paid to do that research. So 0.09, a little high, but it's kind of justified, in this case. Then you have your iFund, which I think this one is the most affordable because of what it does and how active people have to be as far as doing the research, and it's a 0.064. So for what we get in return versus how much work people have been putting in, 0.064 expense ratio is not the worst. I think that one's actually the closest that I've seen in other index funds of this type to the expense ratio. And the expense ratios may be a little bit higher inside of the TSP versus outside, because the TSP does mutual funds typically, versus if you're using an ETF, through Vanguard or through Charles Schwab. Those ETFs usually have lower expense ratios because they're computer automated and you don't actually have a person sitting there and managing it, versus in the TSP, you have people who do actively manage this and do pay attention and have to go and make those changes. And then your L fund has a 0.0658 expense ratio, which I think that one's pretty great too for what it is. You have somebody who is actively managing that, actively paying attention and putting a strategy together for your retirement. And so 0.0658 for what it does, for how little effort you have to put into the L fund on your personal end, is not a bad expense ratio. Yeah, so to conclude this video, this was just a little quick breakdown. I can get more in depth in this. I could talk more about it, but I'm trying not to get this video too long. We're trying to keep it as digestible as possible. And so I strongly recommend using your TSP. I strongly recommend trying to get that match if you can. If you're new and you're thinking about joining the Army or you're thinking about joining the Navy, as of December 31st, 2017, there is no longer a pension given to active duty service members. So if you joined, which if you're watching this video and you're not in yet, you are probably joining after December 31st, 2017. Your only option for retirement now is the TSP, which in my opinion, I think may be a little bit better because you get the match up to 10% and you are being active in your retirement. And it also gives you a chance to not have to do 20 years of service like you previously had to get a pension, right? So 80% of service members were not making the time link to get a retirement, or they were getting forced out or kicked out before retirement, because there are certain time links that you had to meet at certain ranks to stay in. And so those have changed recently. Now I'm pretty sure you can make E6 and retire as an E6 now if you've been in before the cutoff of the pension. So if you're in before December 31st, 2017, you can retire as an E6 in the service. But everybody, January 1st, 2018, the pension is your option, right? And so I would take full advantage of it. I would max it out at that 10%, get that match, which means you're getting 20% of your income put into your TSP every year. And I would even increase in that every time you get a pay increase. Every time you get that January 1st, we get that pay increase. Every 2 years, after 4 years, you get a pay increase. I would increase that TSP contributions. Although you want to get matched to the 10%, you won't even notice that money coming out if you increase it 1% every January 1st, if you increase it another percent every second anniversary that you have. And with that being said, if you liked this video, you thought it was helpful, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. I use, since we're talking about retirement accounts, we're talking about saving for the future, I use Acorns as another one of my avenues. I'll put it's not an affiliate link, but if you join, I'm pretty sure Acorns will give you 20 bucks. They'll give me 20 bucks. Sometimes they have promotions here or there. I think if I get 5 people during this month, during the month of April, I think I'll get 800 bucks. I'm not sure. I don't always check it. They give me notifications every now and then. Totally by your choice. I will be uploading a video about Acorns eventually on this channel. But if you don't know anything about Acorns, there should be plenty of YouTube content out there. It's a retirement account, essentially. I shouldn't say a retirement account, because retirement account means you can't pull that out, but it is an investment account that they use ETFs that are similar to the ones that we spoke about today. So if you're thinking about using your TSP, you don't even know, you can kind of use this as a test run. And one more disclaimer, everything that I said about the TSP today, it does reflect on a 401k. I don't have a 401k, I have a TSP, so I don't have access to those funds. And so you would have to go and make sure that those funds line up the same way that the TSP is. But I would like to imagine that it is almost probably exact because maybe a little bit of expense ratio changes here or there, and you may even have access to one or two extra funds. So with that, peace.